Good morning. I just want to take a moment to thank Sam for the way that he led us in prayer this morning, for Noah and Ben, for the ways that they helped to remind us and taught me something about communion and the importance of the covenant that we're able to share with each other and with our God. And I'm thankful for both of them, for all three of them. I'm so proud of them and who they are. And it's just such a blessing to get to walk with them. And then it's been so much fun to get to partner with Logan this week, to get to lead with one of my best friends in the whole world. And so, Logan, you always do such a beautiful job of helping us to experience the presence of God. And His presence is at work in this space, and we all have confidence in that. But Logan always is so thoughtful and intentional in the way that he plans our worship. So thank you for leading us. I want to jump right in because there's a lot that I want to get to this morning as we continue Jason's theme, Kingdom Stories. And we're going to do that today by walking through the parable of the Good Samaritan. So if you want to go ahead and turn to Luke chapter 10, that's where we're going to be at this morning. That's going to be our text here. So one of the things that I found interesting this past week as I was studying and preparing was a connection that was made between the parable of the Good Samaritan and the story that immediately follows it, the story of Mary and Martha. And so a theologian by the name of Gonzalez made this initial connection for me, but I really found that this connection helped me to see these two stories with fresh eyes. Like most biblical writers, Luke is really intentional about the way that he's crafting his gospel. He tells us this, and we see this here, I believe, as he places these stories side by side. In those first 4 verses in the Gospel of Luke, he writes that he's taken into account all these different eyewitness versions of the story of Jesus. And he's been really intentional about investigating it carefully. Each of these accounts and putting this orderly account so that we might have confidence in the story that we know of Jesus. In particular, if you look at this overarching story in Luke, he is deliberate in painting a clear picture of who Jesus is and the kingdom he is inaugurating. You see, this kingdom that Jesus is proclaiming is a radical reversal of the cultural norms and expectations that would have been normal in the first century world that he found himself in, both on the Greco-Roman side and the Jewish side. You see, these stories and teachings actually lead up to our passage in Luke chapter 10. And along the way, we see Jesus outlining this reversal. He turns the Jewish teaching of Sabbath on its head and reminds them of the heart of what the Sabbath was all about. He initiates a kingdom economic, declaring that those who are poor are blessed, for theirs is the kingdom of God, and that those who are rich are cursed, for they've already received their consolation. This is a reversal of what we know in our expectations, our cultural norms today as well, and a little bit different in Luke compared to the Beatitudes that we find in Matthew. Jesus invites his disciples to not only love their neighbors, but their enemies as well. And he cares for person after person who both the Greco-Roman and the Jewish worlds would have considered outsiders. And each of these teachings and interactions lead us to our text for today in Luke 10. Because both of these stories continue this theme of Jesus' reversal of norms and expectations. In particular, these two stories speak to our internal motivation. They, in what ways does our motivation need reversing? So I think it can be really helpful, especially when we're walking through a narrative passage, to do our best to enter into the text, into the world of the text, and try to find ourselves there, both where we are and where we hope to be. And so I'm hoping that this morning I can facilitate that by walking through these 4 perspectives of different people in the stories that we find here: the lawyer, the priest, and the Levite, Martha and Mary. But before we do that, I thought it might be fun to partner with Logan and Kim and sort of remind ourselves of the parable of the Good Samaritan. So Logan and Kim met with a few of our kiddos who were home during fall break, and they're going to remind us a little bit about this story that we've got this morning.
So one day Jesus was preaching. There was a man that came to Jesus, and he wanted to know how to be a neighbor to others. And Jesus said, "What does the Bible say?" And he said that he should love his neighbor as he loves himself. So Jesus told him a story about a man. There was a man walking on his own, and he was going to a place, and a bunch of people, some people came up to him and beat him up. The enemies jumped out and beat at him. These robbers beat this guy up on the road or something.
He was robbed and then laid across the road.
And he was bleeding really bad. There was a man that worked at a church.
A priest came by, one of the most religious people at that time.
And he said, "I cannot help him. He looks already dead." And he just walked on the other side of the road
And completely ignored him.
And then a Levi came. He looked for a second, but he still went past. He did the same thing. A couple more hours passed, and then the Good Samaritan walked by.
Where do you think the Samaritan is from?
Samaritanville? And then he saw that this Jew was beat up. The man thought, he's not going to help me. He's going to be mean to me, but then he wasn't. So I went to go help him. And he said, "Look at this fellow, we need to help him."
And patched up his wounds.
He bandaged up the man where his hurt places were, and he helped the person who had boo-boos. So he went to his donkey and got some oil and wine and poured it and put it on his bleeding places. And he put bandages and medicine on him. And then he carried him onto the donkey, and they went to a village.
And brought him to an inn.
And then he stayed with him for a day, and he gave him a place to sleep.
And he paid for everything he needed, and he said, "If there's anything else this man needs, I will come back and pay for it."
He gave him some pennies. Money. The Samaritan left. He was healed. Are you going to put that on the screen?
Mr. Logan will make you look at the blooper.
Great. All right. They did awesome, right? That was so good. Okay. All right. So the first character that I want to dive into is the lawyer. So let's dive into this text. It's going to be Luke chapter 10, starting in verse 25. So let's read this together. On one occasion, an expert in the law, a lawyer, stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Well, Jesus replied, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "Well, you've answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" So in this story, you have a lawyer who approaches Jesus with bad intentions. He's wanting to test Jesus. And every time I read through the Gospels, I'm always amazed at Jesus' perceptive abilities. And he's able to perceive this immediately. And so he asks the lawyer not only, what does the law say, but how do you read it? How do you interpret it? What is your paradigm? What is the lens through which you read the law, through which you see the law and see the world? And so as the lawyer is answering his questions, the lawyer's lens becomes pretty clear. He shows that he has great knowledge of the law. I mean, the man answers Jesus' questions exactly as Jesus would answer them, right? Loving God and loving neighbor. But then we begin to see a little bit of the lawyer's lens. We see his motivation as he asks, well, who is my neighbor? What he really seems to be asking as he's trying to justify his unjust beliefs, he's asking, well, who do I have to love, right? Or who am I permitted to not love? It sounds to me that the lawyer, that there are some people that the lawyer would actually prefer to not be his neighbor. And so in response, Jesus tells him this parable, reversing his question from who is my neighbor, who am I permitted to not love, to who is the neighbor, and what does it actually look like for you to be one? We find a lawyer here motivated by limits. He's pursuing knowledge of the law over intimacy with the Father. He's pursuing a limited love over the limitless, boundless love that we see throughout the biblical narrative and that we are actually invited to experience as we live life with God. And so I wonder this morning if you found yourself in the shoes of the lawyer before, doing everything that you possibly can do to justify why it's okay to not love someone that God has placed in your path. Maybe it's unintentional. Maybe you've been hurt or wronged by someone. But to you, Jesus says there is a deeper, wider, fuller experience of God's love available to you. What might it look like for you to lean in to that love? So then Jesus tells this parable, and the kids did such an awesome job retelling this story, but I just want to read through it again, starting in verse 30. He says, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper and said, "Hey, look after him. And when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have." So in this parable, Jesus drops what would have been a few surprises to his listeners. So the hero wasn't who the lawyer would have anticipated, right? It wasn't the priest or the Levite. No, it was a Samaritan from Samaritanville, of all places. And a Samaritan is never a hero of any story. This would have been a radical reversal of any ethnic, cultural, or religious expectation of Jesus' audience. The priest and the Levite would have been well respected by all of Jesus' listeners. They were doing the Lord's work, right? They were working hard. They were getting all this stuff done. But it seems as if these 2 men, the priest and the Levite, are too hurried by their own agenda to see what God has for them right before their eyes. And you place that next to the Good Samaritan. One was motivated by their own agenda, while the other was motivated by compassion. One saw a person, while the others saw an obstacle. You know, I've always felt convicted by this text. There have been moments in my life where it's almost like, I think Jesus might be speaking directly to me. I can remember a time when Mr. Randy and I were prepping for the Upward basketball celebration. It was early on working here. And this room would have been filled with kids and families. It's always such a fun night. But always a little bit crazy. We got a lot of people that were moving in here, and we really wanted it to be special for the kids. We wanted them to all have a great time, and the event was awesome. Every year, the event was so good, but Mr. Randy and Leanne and Ronnie and I were running all over the place. We're trying to make things perfect, and it was great. But at the end of the night, I was exhausted. I was pooped. I get home and I sort of began to reflect that night. I thought, man, that event may have been a success, but did I really see anybody along the way? Like, I wondered, was I too worried making sure that everything was just right, that I missed the possibilities for connection that Jesus had laid at my feet? That was really a pivotal moment for me and really formative, like, you know, of how I want to do ministry, how I want to live, to be honest. You know, I don't want to live my life going from task to task. I don't want to wake up in the morning and the first thing that I think about is all the stuff that I got to do on my to-do list. Like, I don't want to wake up and think, okay, I got to make sure that I go do this and this and this. Like, I don't think Jesus wants that for me either. Like, I don't think Jesus wants that for me. I think Jesus actually calls us to live person by person. He calls us to be motivated by people and compassion, not tasks or efficiency. Even when tasks aren't that bad. Like, even when tasks are good, sometimes the good that God has in front of us is better. And this mindset is a radical reversal of the first century world, but it's a radical reversal of our American culture today. And so I wonder if you found yourself in the shoes of the priest and Levite, driven by your agenda, by the tasks that you have before you, by your busy schedule, so much so that you miss the people that God has placed right in front of you. So much so that you miss God himself. And so we have this beautifully surprising parable that Jesus shares with this lawyer and his followers. And then we follow that with the most relatable story, maybe in all of Scripture, a story about two sisters, Mary and Martha. And so we're gonna read this together. Actually, our friend Declan is gonna read this for us. And so if y'all will look at the screen.
Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving and went up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her.
Awesome job, Declan. I love the hearts of both of these women here. Like every time I read this story, I've just got so much empathy for Martha. You've got Martha here who's just trying to do what she thinks is right. Like all she's doing is she's trying to fulfill her duties as a hostess. And then you've got Mary, who delights at the opportunity to get to sit at the feet of Jesus. And again, in this story, Jesus reverses the norms and expectations that would have been anticipated in the first century. You know, Kim reminded me this week that during this time, women would not have been allowed to learn at the feet of a rabbi. And so Jesus turns this turns this norm on its head. But then he also reverses some of the hospitality norms. You see, as far as society is concerned, Martha is exactly where she's supposed to be. She's exactly where she's expected to be. She's working hard to make sure that everything is just right for her guest. And her guest just so happens to be the Son of God, of all people, right? And in fact, Mary is actually probably supposed to be helping Martha. Mary's not supposed to be at the feet of Jesus. Mary's not supposed to be like sitting there listening. Mary's supposed to be helping her sister. But Martha is being driven not just to serve Jesus necessarily, but she's driven, it seems, by a little bit of a sense of obligation, that this is what she's got to do. And this leads to her feeling isolated. And resentment actually grows inside her as she approaches the rabbi saying, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do this work by myself? Tell her to help me. And Jesus replies to Martha, he says, Martha, Mary has chosen the good portion. In this story, Martha is driven by obligation, by her sense of duty and responsibility. But instead, that obligation prevents her from encountering the presence of the living God who's actually sitting in her living room. And so I wonder if you've found yourself in Martha's shoes before, motivated by a sense of obligation, motivated by success, by a sense of duty and responsibility, by this desire to just make things perfect. One of the many things that I've learned from Emily Ann is what I think is her favorite phrase. It's overflow over obligation. So for those of you who are familiar with the Enneagram, Emily Ann is a 2 on there. And those of you who are unfamiliar with the Enneagram, it's a pretty popular personality profile that sort of helps us get to our internal motivation. You know, it's been a really helpful tool for me. It's not gospel. Sometimes I think we can rely too much on these sorts of things, but it's a really helpful tool for me to become more self-aware, to understand and be able to discern if I'm maybe not in the best place, or maybe I'm in a great place and I need to lean into that a little bit. So a 2 on the Enneagram is called a helper. So 2s love to help people. They care for people. They love people, and Emily Ann loves to do all those things, and she does it really, really well. But sometimes when a 2 on the Enneagram is helping, and doesn't feel seen, it can kind of sting a little bit, right? And Martha felt this way too. And truthfully, I have a feeling there are a few of you in here who can really relate to Martha as well. You're out here giving. You are giving your time. You are giving your energy. You are making dinner for people. You're volunteering. You're the first person that people like me call when they need help in ministry. That's who you are, right? That is what you do. If help is needed, you are the first one to sign up. And when the rest of us see that commitment to loving and serving, we ought to thank you, right? We should acknowledge that. But sometimes it's easy for someone who struggles with overcommitment, or maybe even someone who struggles with staying busy for other people, to not care for themselves very well. The goal is that we would love and serve out of the overflow of God's love, right? And not by our own strength, not because we have to, not because we're obligated to love and serve. When we love and serve out of our own strength, it can lead to feelings of resentment and isolation, like Martha was feeling. Feeling obligated to just show up, feeling obligated to give something. But what might it look like for us to love and serve and care out of the overflow of the love that we experience from God Himself? What might it look like to allow Christ's love to be our fuel and not our own strength? I was talking to Emily Ann a little bit about this earlier this week, and I was asking her how she tries to combat some of this. And she said, like, one of the things that she tries to do is praying over what she's doing and how she's serving and loving. So if you're cooking a casserole, what might it look like for you to pray over that casserole? For you to pray over that family, that they might experience the warmth and love through that meal. That you pray over the conversations that might happen around the table as the family eats dinner together. Or maybe you're volunteering, and you pray over the leaders at the event that you're serving at. Or you pray over the people that you're volunteering for, that they might experience God's love, that they might see God's love through your presence. That sounds really biblical to me and super healthy. It reminds me of what John teaches in 1 John 4:19. We love because God first loves us. Or we love out of an overflow of God's love. And this is what I think Martha learned, and it's what I think Mary understood. Loving your neighbor has to overflow from the source of all love, from love itself, from our good God. And I think I actually learned this lesson myself a few years ago, or at least began to learn this lesson. I think I'm still learning this, to be honest with you. But about 7 years ago, I transitioned into the job that I'm currently doing now. And it was actually a pretty difficult season for me. So first, I'd never worked with teenagers before, and to be honest, they kind of scared me a little bit, okay? I'm sure some of you can feel the pain, but they're not that scary. I just want to let that be known. They're awesome. But I was nervous about that. And it was also a pretty major transition for our students as well, as they were navigating a lot of change that time. And to be honest, I was feeling a little bit isolated during that season. I was feeling a little bit alone in the middle of all this change and transition. You know, I was loving getting to know these students. I was having such a good time, but I was also pretty tired. And in the moment, I think I was being fueled by a sense of duty and responsibility as I sought to do my job and care for these students well simply because it was the right thing to do. But I found that I was really working out of my own strength and ability, and there was very little reliance on other people and very little reliance on the Spirit at work within me and around me. And then Trek came. And here's a picture from our Trek Mountain. I saw a few of our Trek folks here this morning, actually. But this week was a real game changer for me. I'd been doing this for several months at that point. And I had just the best time. It was so nice. You know, we keep our phones at base camp, so I didn't have my phone, which was awesome. None of the students did or adults did. And we just had the funnest time. And up till that point, I don't think I had ever felt as close to the Lord as I did that week. And a big part of that was our guide, Ross. And I was so frustrated because I was looking through my camera roll and I had 0 pictures of Ross. I think he was the one who was always taking the photo. But Ross was awesome. Like if you talk to any of the people in this picture, they're going to tell you some stories about our guide Ross that week. But he was a former youth minister, and he loved our group really, really well. And in particular, honestly, I felt really loved and cared for by him. I think because he had done youth ministry before, one of his goals that week was to really pour into me, to see me, to care for me, and I really did feel cared for by him that week. But on the day before we summited, we have this time called Solo Day, where all of us spread out at high camp, and we spend several hours on our own with the Lord. And I love this time. We're going this summer. I'm looking forward to it already. Having those hours on my own, that sounds awesome to get to spend that with the Lord. It's tough for some of our students sometimes. It's that is a long time for quiet. But it's always really formative and helpful for them. But for Ross, he spent those 3 hours, 4 hours, really being intentional about praying for each member of our group and listening to the Lord. And later that night, we're all sitting around the campfire, and he's sharing a little bit about what he prayed for and what he heard. And what he shared with me really, really impacted me. It was super pivotal for me. He said, "Matt, I feel like God is seeking to transform your duty into desire." And in that moment, a lot clicked for me. You know, the Lord doesn't want my obligation. He doesn't want my responsibility. He doesn't want perfection. He doesn't want simply my proud sense of duty. He wants me. He wanted Martha. He wanted Mary. And he wants you. He wants your heart. He wants your schedule and your time. He wants your family. He wants your presence. That's what he wants. He wants you. And he wants you because he longs to spend time with you because he loves you. And so I think these 2 stories, they're all about the motivations behind our invitation to love God and love our neighbor. It's not simply about our action. It's not about loving or serving. It's not simply about being a servant. It's about our why. It's about what's behind our serving and loving. And so, as we close this morning, I'd like to encourage each of us to take some time to reflect. You know, I know this is the time where it's easy to turn to class and get ready, but I just want to invite you to slow your heart and your mind to really be with the Lord here in this moment. As we all reflect on our motivation. If it's helpful for you, you might just take a moment to close your eyes, to not be distracted by what's around you. But I wonder if you find yourself today in the shoes of the lawyer that tests Jesus, motivated by the pursuit of the knowledge of the law over the pursuit of intimacy with God. If you find yourself choosing a limited love over the limitless, boundless love that we're able to experience as we walk in the Spirit. Or perhaps you find yourself in the shoes of the priest or the Levite, driven by your agenda, by your busy schedule, by the tasks that you have before you. So much so that you miss the people that God has placed in your path, or maybe even missing God himself. Or maybe this morning you really connect with Martha. You're tired. You're motivated by this sense of duty and responsibility and obligation within you. You're driven to make things just perfect for everybody around you, but even if it leads you to feeling isolated or resentful. The good news is the Spirit meets you in those places and seeks to transform your motivation. He seeks to transform your limited love into a limitless love. He seeks to transform your task-driven agenda into a people-driven compassion. He longs for you to love out of overflow of the love that He showered over you rather than out of your own sense of obligation. And He wants nothing more than to transform your duty to love Him into a deep, deep desire. So during this song, I hope that you'll take this opportunity to connect with the Lord. That's why we're here after all. It's to connect with Him, to connect with one another. And so you can maybe do that privately in your seat, or maybe with the people around you, or publicly in front of our whole church family. Or maybe you're ready to answer this call to participate in the love that Jesus has for you by giving yourself over to Him in baptism. Each of these invitations is available to you today as we stand.